The telegram slipped from Rebecca Walker's trembling fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird as the news of her husband's death in a mining accident shattered what little security she had left in the world. She clutched her son Tommy to her chest, the 4-year-old boy oblivious to how their lives had just changed forever. It was 1878, and being a widow with a child in the unforgiving terrain of Mojave, Arizona territory, meant only one thing: survival would require every ounce of strength she possessed. Rebecca had been living in Mojave for only 6 months when tragedy struck. The small settlement nestled in the shadow of desert mountains had promised opportunity when she and Daniel arrived from Illinois. They had been so full of hope then, with Daniel finding steady work at the silver mine 15 miles south of town and Rebecca establishing herself as a skilled seamstress. Now, with winter giving way to spring, she faced an uncertain future alone. The small cabin Daniel had built sat on a plot of land close to Sawmill Creek, which meandered lazily most of the year but could transform into something fearsome during heavy rains. The location had seemed ideal when they first arrived: clean water nearby and good soil for a small garden. Rebecca had not anticipated how the grief of widowhood would compound the challenges of frontier life. "Mama, why are you crying?" Tommy asked, his blue eyes wide with concern as he patted her cheek. His father's death meant little to him at his young age. Daniel had often been gone for days at the mine, and Tommy had grown accustomed to his absences. "I am just feeling a bit sad today, little one," Rebecca replied, forcing a smile. "Why don't you help me collect eggs from the chickens before the rain comes?" The dark clouds gathering on the western horizon worried her. Spring storms in this region were unpredictable, sometimes bringing gentle showers and other times unleashing torrents that transformed the landscape. She would need to prepare. As Tommy chased after a particularly stubborn hen, Rebecca caught sight of a rider approaching from the direction of town. The tall figure silhouetted against the threatening sky rode with the easy confidence of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. "Mrs. Walker." The man called as he drew closer, tipping his hat respectfully. "Kurt Thornton, madam. I run cattle about 10 miles north of here. Sheriff Michaels asked me to check on folks along the creek. There's been heavy rain up in the mountains and they're worried about flooding." Rebecca looked up at the stranger, taking in his weathered face and kind eyes. He couldn't have been more than 30, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a working cowboy. His horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding, snorted and stamped impatiently. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Thornton, but we should be fine. The creek's never risen more than a few feet since we've been here. With all due respect, madam, this isn't like regular storms. Sheriff says there's been a cloudburst up north. Might be wise to gather anything valuable and head to higher ground for the night." Tommy had returned with 3 eggs cradled carefully in his small hands. "Look, Mama, are those thunder clouds? Will there be lightning?" Kurt dismounted in one fluid motion and crouched down to Tommy's eye level. "That's mighty fine egg collecting, young man. What's your name?" "I'm Thomas Daniel Walker, but everyone calls me Tommy," the boy replied proudly. "I'm 4.5. "Well, Tommy, those are indeed storm clouds, and I bet they'll put on quite a show. But storms can be dangerous too, which is why I'm suggesting you and your mom might want to come into town until it passes." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "Thank you, but I can't leave this place. Everything we have is here." Kurt looked as though he wanted to argue but instead nodded respectfully. "I understand, Mrs. Walker. Let me at least help you secure things before the storm hits." Over the next hour, Kurt proved himself invaluable. He moved heavy furniture away from the windows, reinforced the chicken coop, and helped Rebecca move important documents and keepsakes to higher shelves. All the while, he entertained Tommy with stories of his adventures as a cattle driver. "Mr. Thornton drove 500 cows all the way from Texas, Mama," Tommy exclaimed, his eyes wide with wonder. "That's quite impressive," Rebecca admitted, warming to the cowboy's easy manner and genuine kindness. It had been months since Tommy had shown such excitement. Since Daniel's death, the boy had grown quiet, as though he sensed the weight of sorrow his mother carried. As Kurt prepared to leave, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The wind had picked up considerably, bending the cottonwood trees along the creek bank. "I still think you should come to town," he said, concern evident in his voice. "I don't like leaving you out here." "We'll be fine," Rebecca assured him, though the intensifying storm had begun to unnerve her. "The cabin is solid. Daniel built it himself." Kurt reluctantly mounted his horse. "I'll check back tomorrow to make sure you're all right. If the water rises more than a foot, don't get to higher ground immediately." Rebecca watched him ride away, Tommy waving enthusiastically beside her. As they returned to the cabin, the skies opened up completely, rain coming down in blinding sheets. She lit the oil lamps and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Tommy's sake, though anxiety gnawed at her. They ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, the steady drumming of rain on the roof nearly drowning out Tommy's chatter. Rebecca read to him from a tattered copy of Robin Hood until his eyelids grew heavy. She tucked him into his small bed in the alcove off the main room and kissed his forehead. "Mama, will the cowboy come back tomorrow?" Tommy asked sleepily. "I believe he will," Rebecca replied, surprised by how the thought comforted her. "Good, I like him. He knows about horses and cows and everything." Rebecca smiled. "Sleep now, little one. The storm will be gone by morning." But as the night progressed, the storm only intensified. Rebecca found sleep impossible as she listened to the rain pounding against the cabin walls and the increasingly worrying sound of rushing water from the creek. Around midnight, she lit a lantern and peered through the window toward the creek bed. What she saw made her blood run cold. The normally docile Sawmill Creek had become a raging torrent, its banks already overflowing. Water was creeping steadily across their property toward the cabin. If it continued to rise at this rate, they would need to leave, and soon. Rebecca hurriedly packed a small bundle of essential items and important papers, then moved to wake Tommy. The boy grumbled at first but became fully alert when a loud crack of thunder shook the cabin. "Mama, I'm scared," he whispered, clinging to her nightgown. "It's just a storm, love. We're going to take a little adventure to higher ground until it passes." She helped him dress quickly, trying to keep her voice steady despite her mounting fear. Just as they finished preparing, Rebecca heard a new sound above the storms roar, a splintering crack followed by a rush of water. She flung open the cabin door to see a wall of water surging toward them. The creek had completely jumped its banks, and the force of it had brought down several trees upstream, creating a temporary dam that had now broken. "We need to go now," she shouted, grabbing Tommy's hand and their small bundle of belongings. They splashed through ankle-deep water toward the sloping ground behind their property. If they could reach the ridge beyond their garden, they would be safe from the flooding. They had made it halfway across the yard when Tommy stumbled in the dark, crying out as he fell. Rebecca lifted him, but in the confusion and darkness, she lost her footing on the increasingly muddy ground. They both went down, the swift current of water already strong enough to pull at them. "Hold on to me, Tommy," Rebecca screamed, clutching her son with one arm while trying to find purchase on anything solid with the other. The floodwaters swirled around them, rising rapidly to her waist. A massive surge swept through, stronger than before, ripping Tommy from her grasp. Rebecca's scream tore through the night as she saw her son's small body carried away by the churning waters. "Tommy!" She lunged after him, fighting against the powerful current, but another wave knocked her back against the trunk of a cottonwood tree. The impact left her dazed, but she could still see Tommy's terrified face as the floodwaters carried him downstream toward the main channel of the now monstrous creek. Rebecca struggled to her feet, screaming her son's name as she stumbled along the edge of the flood path, desperately trying to keep him in sight. The rain continued to fall in blinding sheets, and she lost track of him several times before spotting his small form caught momentarily against a fallen log, only to be swept away again before she could reach him. The roar of the water was deafening, but above it she heard hoofbeats and a man's voice calling out. Through the curtain of rain, she saw Kurt Thornton riding hard toward her, his horse fighting against the wind and mud. "My son!" she screamed as Kurt reined in beside her. The water took Tommy. Without hesitation, Kurt leapt from his horse. "Where?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the raging floodwaters. Rebecca pointed downstream where the creek turned sharply around a bend. "There." He was caught on something, but then the water Kurt was already moving, stripping off his heavy coat and gun belt. "Get to higher ground," he shouted over his shoulder. "I'll find him." Before Rebecca could respond, Kurt had plunged into the floodwaters, powerful strokes taking him into the main current. She watched in horror and hope as the cowboy was swept around the bend, disappearing into the darkness and rain. Rebecca ran along the edge of the flooding, ignoring the branches that tore at her clothing and skin. Her heart hammered in her chest, a prayer repeating with every beat. "Please, God, please save my boy. Please let him be alive." The terrain grew more difficult as she followed the course of the creek. In daylight, this path would be challenging. In the darkness and rain, it was treacherous. Twice she fell, the second time sliding dangerously close to the raging waters before catching herself on an exposed root. After what seemed an eternity, the creek widened into a natural pool where the current slowed somewhat before continuing downstream. Through the rain, Rebecca thought she saw movement on the far bank, a large figure carrying something small. "Tommy!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Kurt!" The figure turned, and even through the rain, she could see Kurt staggering under the weight of her son. He had made it across the worst of the rapids, but was now separated from her by 30 feet of swirling floodwaters. "Stay there," Kurt shouted. "He's alive. I'll bring him to you." Rebecca watched, heart in her throat, as Kurt assessed the waters between them. He shifted Tommy's limp form to his shoulders and waded carefully into the shallower edge of the flood, testing each step before committing his weight. The water still reached his chest in places, and the current remained strong enough to threaten his balance, but he moved with deliberate determination. When Kurt finally reached her side of the creek, Rebecca rushed forward, taking Tommy into her arms. The boy's eyes were closed, his small body cold and still. "He swallowed some water," Kurt gasped, breathing heavily from his exertion. "But he was conscious when I reached him. He's a fighter, your boy." As if hearing Kurt's words, Tommy suddenly coughed violently, water spilling from his mouth as his eyes fluttered open. Rebecca sobbed with relief, holding him close as he began to cry. "Mama," he whimpered. "The water was so cold." "I know, love, I know." She looked up at Kurt, who stood dripping and exhausted beside them. "You saved him. How can I ever thank you?" Kurt shook his head. "No need for thanks. We need to get you both someplace warm and dry." He looked around, getting his bearings in the storm. "My cabin's closer than town." "Can you walk a little further?" "I left my horse tethered back near your place." Rebecca nodded, cradling Tommy against her chest. "I can walk." The journey to Kurt's cabin took over an hour, with Kurt leading his horse while Rebecca rode with Tommy wrapped in Kurt's coat. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, but his breathing remained steady. By the time they reached the small but solid cabin nestled against a rocky hillside, the rain had finally begun to slacken. Kurt quickly built up the fire while Rebecca stripped Tommy of his wet clothes and wrapped him in a wool blanket. The cowboy disappeared briefly into another room and returned with a set of dry clothes for Rebecca. "They'll be too big, but they're dry," he said, averting his eyes respectfully. "I'll tend to Tommy while you change." Rebecca gratefully accepted the clothing, a flannel shirt and trousers that indeed swam on her slender frame. When she emerged from the small bedroom where she had changed, she found Kurt sitting by the fire, Tommy on his lap wrapped in blankets and sipping from a mug of warm milk with honey. "The color's coming back to his cheeks," Kurt said softly. "He's going to be just fine." "I was floating, Mama," Tommy said, his voice stronger than she had dared hope. "But Mr. Kurt swam really fast and caught me before the monsters could get me." "Monsters?" Rebecca asked, sitting beside them. "I think he means the logs and debris in the water," Kurt explained. "There was a lot of it rushing downstream. That's actually what caught him. His shirt snagged on a branch that was wedged between two rocks. If it hadn't been for that." He left the sentence unfinished, but Rebecca understood. If not for that chance snag, Tommy would have been swept miles downstream where his tiny body might never have been found. "You risked your life," she said, meeting Kurt's eyes. "Those rapids could have killed you." Kurt shrugged. "Couldn't stand by and do nothing." He looked down at Tommy, who had begun to doze against his chest. "Besides, this little man is worth the risk." They sat in comfortable silence as the storm gradually subsided outside. Rebecca found herself studying Kurt's profile in the firelight, the strong jaw covered with a day's stubble, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years under the sun, the gentle way his large hands cradled her sleeping son. "I came back to check on you," Kurt said after a while. "When I saw how fast the creek was rising, I knew you might be in trouble. I was almost too late." "But you weren't," Rebecca said softly. "You came exactly when we needed you most." Kurt carefully transferred the sleeping Tommy to Rebecca's arms. "You should both get some rest. Take my bed." "I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I couldn't possibly, please," Kurt insisted. "It's no hardship. I've slept under the stars in far worse conditions than a cabin floor." Rebecca didn't have the energy to argue. She carried Tommy to Kurt's bedroom, a simple space with a sturdy bed, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. She settled Tommy on the bed and lay down beside him, listening to his steady breathing and offering silent prayers of gratitude. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tommy being torn from her grasp, his terrified face disappearing in the floodwaters. When she did drift off, her dreams were filled with rushing water and desperate reaches that fell just short. She awoke before dawn to find Tommy still sleeping peacefully beside her. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind the fresh scent of rain-washed air drifting through the partially open window. Rebecca slipped quietly from the bed and made her way to the main room. Kurt was already awake, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. He looked up as she entered, offering a warm smile that reached his eyes. "Morning," he said softly. "How's our brave swimmer? Still sleeping?" "He seems remarkably well, considering." Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how she must look in borrowed clothes, her hair a tangled mess. "Children are resilient," Kurt replied, pouring a cup of coffee and offering it to her. "More so than we give them credit for sometimes." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully. "I need to see what's left of our cabin, if anything," Kurt nodded. "I rode out at first light to check. The waters have receded some, but—" He hesitated. "Your cabin's still standing, but it took on a lot of water." The garden's gone and one of the walls has significant damage. It's not livable right now." Rebecca closed her eyes, absorbing this new blow. Everything they had, everything she had left of Daniel was in that cabin. "I need to see it," she said firmly. "Of course. After breakfast, I'll take you there." They ate a simple meal of cornbread and bacon, which Tommy devoured with surprising enthusiasm when he joined them, seemingly unaffected by his ordeal. Rebecca marveled at her son's resilience, how quickly he had bounced back from an experience that had left her shaken to her core. After breakfast, Kurt saddled his horse and another smaller mare he kept for pack trips. Rebecca sat behind him on his gelding while Tommy rode securely in front of him, chattering excitedly about the adventure of riding a real cowboy's horse. The landscape, revealed by daylight, was dramatically altered. Where Sawmill Creek had once been a modest stream, it now carved a much wider path through the countryside. Uprooted trees, portions of fences, and unidentifiable debris littered the expanded banks. When they reached Rebecca's property, the sight brought tears to her eyes. The cabin stood, as Kurt had said, but was clearly uninhabitable. Mud coated everything up to waist height inside, and one entire wall bowed dangerously outward. The chicken coop was completely gone, along with her small vegetable garden. The only structures relatively untouched were the outhouse and tool shed, both situated on slightly higher ground. "It's worse than I thought," she whispered, surveying the damage. Kurt dismounted and lifted Tommy down before helping Rebecca. "I'm sorry, but walls can be rebuilt. The important thing is that you and Tommy are safe." Rebecca moved through the mud-filled cabin in a daze, salvaging what she could: a few photographs, Daniel's Bible, some cooking utensils that could be cleaned. Most of their clothing was ruined and the mattresses were soaked through. "What will we do now, Mama?" Tommy asked, his earlier excitement dampened by the sight of their home in such condition. Before Rebecca could answer, Kurt stepped forward. "Mrs. Walker, I hope you won't find this presumptuous, but I'd like to offer you and Tommy shelter at my place until your cabin can be repaired. I have the space, and with the help of some neighbors, we could have this fixed up within a few weeks." Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "That's very generous, Mr. Thornton, but I couldn't impose. It's no imposition," he interrupted gently. "I have a spare room that's going unused, and frankly, having some company would be welcome. I've been on my own too long." He crouched down to Tommy's level. "Besides, I could use a strong helper like Tommy to give me a hand with the horses. What do you say, partner?" Tommy's face lit up. "Can we, Mama, please?" Rebecca hesitated. Accepting such an offer from a man she barely knew went against everything she had been taught about propriety. Yet there was something about Kurt Thornton that inspired trust, and her options were painfully limited. "I would insist on working to earn our keep," she said finally. "I'm a skilled seamstress and I can cook and clean." Kurt smiled. "That sounds like a fair arrangement to me. Though I should warn you, my cooking's limited to about 3 dishes, so any improvement there would be mighty welcome." And so it was decided. They gathered what little could be salvaged, and Kurt helped Rebecca board up the broken wall and secure the cabin as best they could against further damage. By midday, they were riding back to Kurt's ranch, Tommy chattering excitedly about the horses he would help tend. Kurt's ranch was modest but well-maintained. The main cabin was larger than Rebecca had realized the night before, with a spacious common area, 2 bedrooms, and a lean-to kitchen addition. A barn and corral stood nearby, housing 5 horses and a milk cow. A small bunkhouse suggested Kurt occasionally employed help, though he explained he currently ran the operation alone. "It's not much," Kurt said as he showed them around. "I've been meaning to expand, but there never seems to be time." "It's wonderful," Rebecca said sincerely. The ranch had a welcoming feel despite its simplicity, clean, organized, and practical. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a single bed and a trundle beneath it that Kurt pulled out for Tommy. "I built this thinking someday I might have a family," he explained, somewhat self-consciously. "Never quite got around to that part. No wife waiting for you somewhere?" Rebecca asked before she could stop herself. Kurt shook his head. "There was someone once back in Texas. Didn't work out." His expression suggested there was more to the story, but Rebecca didn't press. The next days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Rebecca took over the cooking and household tasks, while Tommy appointed himself Kurt's official ranch hand, following the cowboy everywhere and absorbing every bit of knowledge about horses, cattle, and ranch life that Kurt shared. True to his word, Kurt recruited neighbors to help with Rebecca's cabin. Every few days, he would ride out to check on the progress and bring back reports. The work was proceeding well, though it would take time to completely restore the structure. One evening, about 2 weeks after the flood, Rebecca found Kurt sitting on the porch after Tommy had gone to bed. She brought him a cup of coffee and sat in the chair beside him. "Tommy asked if he could call you Kurt instead of Mr. Thornton," she said. "I hope that's all right." Kurt chuckled. "More than all right. Mr. Thornton makes me feel like my father." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "He talks about you constantly, you know," Rebecca said softly. "You've become quite the hero in his eyes." "He's a special boy. Smart as a whip, too. Been teaching him to ride on old Buttercup. She's gentle as they come. He's taking to it like he was born in the saddle." Rebecca smiled. "He never showed much interest in riding before." His father, she stopped, realizing she rarely spoke of Daniel anymore. The grief was still there, but it had changed somehow, becoming less raw and more like a dull ache she carried with her. "Tell me about him," Kurt said gently. "Your husband." Rebecca hesitated, then found herself sharing memories of Daniel, his kindness, his dreams for their future in Arizona territory, his love for Tommy. Kurt listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "He sounds like he was a good man," Kurt said when she finally fell silent. "He was, and I miss him every day, but—" She looked out at the stars. "It's different now. When it first happened, the grief was so overwhelming I could barely function. Now I can remember the good things without feeling like I'm drowning." Kurt nodded, understanding. "Time doesn't heal all wounds, like they say, but it does change them into something you can carry." Rebecca glanced at him. "You speak from experience." "My parents died in a house fire when I was 19, Kurt said quietly. "My younger sister, too. I was out breaking horses for a neighbor that night, came home to ashes." "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "It was a long time ago, 15 years now." He covered her hand with his own briefly. "But you never quite get over losing family. You just learn to build a new life around the hole they left." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but something had changed between them. A deeper understanding, a recognition of shared experience that created a bond neither had anticipated. As the weeks passed, this bond strengthened. Rebecca found herself looking forward to evenings on the porch with Kurt after Tommy was asleep. They would talk about everything and nothing: books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they still harbored. Kurt, she discovered, had a surprising knowledge of literature for a man who had spent most of his life working cattle. His mother had been a schoolteacher before marrying his father, and she had insisted on educating her children beyond the basics typically taught in frontier schools. "She'd be horrified at how rusty my Latin has gotten," Kurt joked one evening. but I can still recite most of Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey from memory." "I'd like to hear that sometime," Rebecca said, surprised by this revelation. Kurt looked embarrassed. "Been a while since I've had cause to recite poetry. Not much call for it on the range." A month after the flood, Kurt took Rebecca to see the progress on her cabin. The walls had been repaired, the mud cleaned out, and new furniture built to replace what had been destroyed. Rebecca was overwhelmed by the community's generosity. "People here look after their own," Kurt explained. "And they think highly of you, Rebecca. Your skill with a needle has won you many friends." Indeed, Rebecca had been busy during her stay at Kurt's ranch. Word had spread that she was taking in sewing, and women from Mojave and surrounding farms had brought garments needing alteration, repair, or complete creation. The income wasn't substantial, but it gave her a sense of independence that she valued deeply. As they rode back to Kurt's ranch, Rebecca found herself torn. The cabin would be habitable within another week or two. She and Tommy would return to their own home, and this interlude at Kurt's ranch would end. The thought left her with an unexpected sense of loss. "Tommy's going to miss the horses," she said, trying to identify the source of her melancholy. Kurt glanced at her. "Just the horses." Rebecca met his gaze. "No, not just the horses." That evening, after Tommy had been put to bed with a story about cowboys and cattle drives, Kurt found Rebecca on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the slight chill of the autumn evening. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting beside her. "Your cabin's almost ready, but winter's coming. The roof still needs work, and that north wall may not hold against the first heavy snow." Rebecca nodded. She had been concerned about the same issues. "I was wondering if you might consider staying through the winter," Kurt continued, his voice carefully neutral. "For safety's sake. Come spring, we can make sure everything at your place is properly repaired." Rebecca studied his face in the lantern light. "For safety's sake," she repeated softly. Kurt met her eyes. "Well, that's one reason. There are others. Such as Tommy loving it here." Kurt hesitated, then added more quietly, "And me loving having both of you here." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Rebecca's heart beat faster as she recognized the moment for what it was, a cautious step towards something neither had expected to find. "Kurt," she began, uncertain how to respond. He held up a hand. "You don't need to say anything now, just consider it. No pressure, no expectations. If you want to return to your cabin, I'll help you get settled and make sure you have everything you need." Rebecca nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I'll think about it." The next morning, Rebecca was kneading bread dough when Tommy burst into the kitchen, his face alight with excitement. "Mama, Kurt says I can help him bring in the new calf. There's a cow having a baby right now." Kurt appeared in the doorway behind Tommy, looking apologetic. "Sorry for the interruption. He was helping me check the herd when we noticed Bessie in labor. Thought he might want to see something special." Rebecca smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "Just be careful, Tommy. Do exactly as Kurt says." "Yes, Mama," Tommy rushed out, Kurt following with a warm glance back at Rebecca. Watching them go, Rebecca was struck by how naturally Kurt had slipped into a role that had been vacant in Tommy's life. Not replacing Daniel, but creating something new and valuable. The boy needed a man like Kurt in his life, someone steady, kind, and willing to share knowledge of the world. And what about what she needed? The thought came unbidden, making her cheeks warm. Since Daniel's death, Rebecca had focused solely on survival and caring for Tommy. She had not allowed herself to consider her own needs or desires beyond the practical necessities of life. Yet in the quiet moments with Kurt, conversations on the porch, shared meals, the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, she had begun to feel something she had not expected to feel again. An awakening of possibility. A tentative opening of a heart she had believed permanently closed by grief. When Kurt and Tommy returned hours later, dirty but triumphant with tales of the new calf's arrival, Rebecca watched them together and made her decision. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep exhausted from his exciting day, Rebecca found Kurt in the barn, checking on the pregnant mare that was due to foal within the month. "She's doing well," Kurt said as Rebecca approached. "Should have a healthy foal before the first snow." "Tommy can't wait," Rebecca replied, leaning against the stall door. "He talks of nothing else lately." Kurt smiled. "He's got a way with animals. Never seen a child so natural around horses." Rebecca took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about your offer about staying through the winter." Kurt turned to face her fully, his expression carefully neutral. "And? I think it would be good for Tommy. He's thriving here in a way I haven't seen since before Daniel died." Kurt nodded. "And what about you, Rebecca? Would staying be good for you too?" The directness of the question caught her off guard, though she should have expected it from Kurt. He was not a man who talked around difficult subjects. "I think it might be," she admitted. "I feel at peace here, safe, not just because of the roof over our heads, but because—" She hesitated, then continued more softly, "because you're here." Kurt moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I need you to know something, Rebecca. I didn't offer because I expected anything from you. If friendship is all you want or can give, that's enough for me." "What if I find myself wanting more than friendship?" The words slipped out before she could reconsider them, surprising her with their honesty. Kurt's expression softened. "Then we take it slow, day by day. No rush, no pressure." Rebecca nodded, relieved by his understanding. "I'd like that." In the weeks that followed, Rebecca and Kurt developed a new rhythm to their relationship. Nothing was overtly different. They still shared meals, worked alongside each other during the day, and talked on the porch in the evenings. But there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them now, a recognition of feelings growing beyond simple friendship. Kurt began teaching Rebecca to ride properly, something she had never learned despite living in frontier territory. Tommy delighted in seeing his mother on horseback, offering enthusiastic advice based on his own limited experience. "You have to hold the reins like Kurt showed us, Mama," he would call, perched confidently on Buttercup, while Rebecca tentatively guided her mount around the corral. These riding lessons often led to short excursions around Kurt's property, the three of them exploring together. Kurt knew every hill and valley of his land intimately and shared its history and secrets with obvious pride. Rebecca came to see the beauty of this harsh landscape, through his eyes the subtle colors of the desert, the dramatic rock formations, the surprising abundance of life that thrived in what appeared at first glance to be barren terrain. As October gave way to November, preparations for winter occupied much of their time. Kurt hired 2 young men from town to help bring in the last of the hay and move his small cattle herd to winter pasture. Rebecca preserved what remained of the garden harvest and began knitting warm socks and mittens for all 3 of them. Tommy's 5th birthday arrived in mid-November, and Kurt surprised him with a small saddle of his own, specially made by the saddler in Mojave. "It's adjustable," Kurt explained as Tommy stared wide-eyed at the gift. "It'll fit you for several years as you grow." "My very own saddle," Tommy whispered, running his hands over the tooled leather in awe. Rebecca watched the interaction with tears in her eyes. Kurt had consulted her about the gift beforehand, but seeing Tommy's joy and Kurt's obvious pleasure in that joy affected her deeply. That night, after Tommy had finally been convinced to go to bed without his saddle beside him, Rebecca joined Kurt by the fire. The temperature had dropped considerably over the past week, and the warmth of the hearth was welcome. "Thank you for today," she said, settling into what had become her chair. "I've never seen him so happy." Kurt smiled. "My pleasure. Boy needs his own saddle if he's going to be a proper horseman." "It's more than that." Rebecca hesitated. "You've given him something I couldn't, a man's guidance. He admires you so much, Kurt." "He's easy to admire right back. Smart, brave kid like that." Kurt stared into the fire. "I always wanted children, just never found the right timing, or the right woman." The implied question hung in the air. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm, and not from the fire's heat. "Daniel and I always planned to have more children," she said softly. "Life had other ideas." Kurt reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, some tragic, some—" He met her eyes, "some surprisingly wonderful." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Yes, it does." Their first kiss came a week later, on a crisp morning when frost covered the ground in delicate patterns. Tommy had run ahead to the barn, eager to check on the pregnant mare who was showing signs of imminent foaling. Rebecca and Kurt followed more slowly, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I love watching him like this," Rebecca said, smiling as Tommy disappeared into the barn. "So excited about everything, so full of life." "He reminds me of me at that age," Kurt replied. "Though I was never quite so fearless." Rebecca laughed. "The man who swam through floodwaters to save a child he barely knew claims he wasn't fearless." Kurt stopped walking and turned to face her. "That was different. When something matters enough, fear doesn't enter into it." The intensity in his eyes made Rebecca's breath catch. "Kurt." He reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to step away if she chose, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You matter enough, Rebecca. You and Tommy both." Rebecca leaned into his touch, her heart racing. "You matter to us too, more than I ever expected anyone could again." Kurt's hand cradled her cheek gently. "May I kiss you?" The formal request, so characteristic of his respect for her boundaries, made Rebecca smile. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." The kiss was gentle at first, a soft press of his lips against hers, but it deepened as Rebecca responded, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. Kurt's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer against the chill of the morning. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Kurt rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for quite some time," he admitted. "Why did you wait so long?" Rebecca asked, her fingers still curled into the fabric of his coat. "Because you needed time. And because some things are worth waiting for." Their moment was interrupted by Tommy's excited shout from the barn. "Mama! Kurt, the baby horse is coming." They spent the morning watching the miracle of new life as the mare delivered a healthy filly with a white star on her forehead. Tommy was transfixed by the process, asking endless questions that Kurt answered with patience and honesty. When the foal stood on wobbly legs for the first time, Tommy clapped his hands in delight. "What will you name her, Kurt?" he asked. Kurt glanced at Rebecca, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think we should let your mother name her. What do you say, Rebecca? What shall we call this little lady?" Rebecca considered the foal, with its rich chestnut coat like its mother's and the distinctive white marking. "Hope," she said finally. "I think we should call her Hope." Kurt's eyes met hers, understanding the significance. "Hope it is." As winter settled fully over the land, their days fell into a comfortable pattern. Kurt worked with his cattle and horses, often with Tommy as his shadow. Rebecca kept the household running smoothly while continuing her sewing business. In the evenings, they would gather by the fire, Kurt reading aloud from one of his books, Tommy building elaborate structures with the wooden blocks Kurt had carved for him, Rebecca working on her latest sewing project. It was domestic and ordinary and, to Rebecca, absolutely precious in its simplicity. She had not expected to find such contentment again after losing Daniel. The guilt that had initially accompanied her growing feelings for Kurt had gradually faded as she came to understand that loving again didn't diminish what she had shared with her first husband. Christmas approached with mounting excitement from Tommy. Kurt rode into Mojave several times on mysterious errands, returning with parcels that he hid away in the storage room. Rebecca secretly worked on gifts of her own, a new shirt for Kurt embroidered with his cattle brand on the pocket, and a toy horse she had commissioned from the carpenter in town for Tommy. On Christmas Eve, they decorated the cabin with pine boughs and red ribbons. Kurt produced a small fir tree he had cut from the foothills, and they adorned it with paper ornaments Tommy had made and a few treasured glass baubles Kurt kept carefully stored away. "They were my mother's," he explained as he unwrapped them from their protective cloth. She loved Christmas more than any other time of year. After a special dinner of roast venison and sweet potatoes, they sat by the fire drinking hot cider. Tommy, exhausted from the day's excitement, fell asleep against Kurt's shoulder. Kurt carried him to bed with a tenderness that made Rebecca's heart swell. When he returned, he sat beside Rebecca on the small sofa. "He's out cold. Doubt even Santa Claus himself could wake him tonight." Rebecca smiled. "Thank you for making this Christmas so special for him, for both of us." Kurt took her hand, his expression growing serious. "Rebecca, I have something I want to ask you, but I'm not sure if the timing is right." Rebecca's heart quickened. "Ask me," she said softly. Kurt shifted to face her more directly. "These past months with you and Tommy have been the happiest of my life. I never expected to find a family at this stage of my life, but that's what you've become to me, the family I always wanted but never thought I'd have." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's. I've kept it all these years, thinking I might never have cause to give it to anyone." Rebecca's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "I love you, Rebecca Walker, and I love that boy of yours like he was my own flesh and blood. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, not to replace what you had with Daniel, but to build something new together." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes as she looked from the ring to Kurt's face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think it was possible to find this kind of happiness again, but you showed me it was." "Is that a yes?" Kurt asked, hope evident in his voice. "Yes," Rebecca said firmly. "Yes, I will marry you, Kurt Thornton." Kurt slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they separated, Rebecca rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "How do you think Tommy will take the news?" Kurt asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. Rebecca smiled. "I think he'll be overjoyed. He already looks at you like you hung the moon." "I want to be a good father to him," Kurt said seriously. "To honor Daniel's memory by raising his son to be a man he would have been proud of." "You already are," Rebecca assured him. "And you will be." They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the small church in Mojave, with Tommy proudly serving as ring bearer. The townspeople turned out despite the winter chill, the community that had helped rebuild Rebecca's cabin now celebrating this new beginning. After the ceremony, Sheriff Michaels approached them with a smile. "Never thought my warning about that flood would lead to this," he said, shaking Kurt's hand. "But I'm mighty glad it did. You two are well matched." "Sometimes disaster brings unexpected blessings," Rebecca replied, her hand secure in Kurt's. That evening, after the celebration had ended and they had returned to the ranch, their ranch now, Tommy asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Now that you're married to Kurt, does that mean he's my pa?" Rebecca exchanged a glance with Kurt before kneeling to her son's level. Kurt is your stepfather now, which is a very special kind of father. Your real father, who loved you very much, will always be your pa, even though he's in heaven. But Kurt loves you too, and he'll be here to take care of us both." Tommy considered this seriously, then looked at Kurt. "Can I call you Pa, Kurt? So I don't get confused with my first pa." Kurt's eyes glistened as he crouched beside Rebecca. "I would be honored if you called me Pa, Kurt. That sounds just right to me." Tommy nodded, satisfied with this arrangement, and hugged them both before running off to check on Hope, the filly he had claimed as especially his own. Kurt helped Rebecca to her feet, his arms slipping around her waist. "Pa, Kurt," he repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Rebecca said, leaning against him. "It suits you." Spring arrived with its customary burst of wildflowers and renewed activity. The cattle required attention as calving season began, and Kurt spent long days in the pastures, often with Tommy riding alongside him on Buttercup. Rebecca divided her time between household management, her growing sewing business, and helping with ranch chores she had become proficient in over the winter. In April, Rebecca shared news that brought even more joy to their household. She was expecting a child, due in late autumn. Kurt's reaction was everything she could have hoped for, a mixture of wonder, excitement, and tender concern for her well-being. Tommy, after initial confusion about where exactly the baby was growing and how it would get out, embraced the idea of becoming a big brother with characteristic enthusiasm. He took to talking to Rebecca's still flat stomach, sharing important information the baby would need to know upon arrival, primarily about horses, his current obsession. As Rebecca's pregnancy progressed, they made improvements to the ranch house, adding a proper nursery adjacent to the main bedroom. Kurt insisted on doing most of the construction himself, working in the evenings after his regular ranch duties were complete. "The baby will need a view of the sunrise," he declared, carefully positioning the small window he was installing. "Best way to start each day." Rebecca watched him work, marveling at how thoroughly her life had transformed in just over a year. From the depths of grief and the terror of nearly losing Tommy to the floodwaters, she had found her way to this, a new marriage built on mutual respect and genuine love, a home filled with laughter, and the prospect of expanding their family. In October, as the leaves began to turn and the air carried the first hints of winter, Rebecca gave birth to a healthy son they named James Daniel Thornton. Kurt, who had paced anxiously throughout her labor, wept unashamedly when the midwife placed the squalling infant in his arms. "Hello, little cowboy," he whispered, carefully cradling the newborn. "Welcome to the family." Tommy approached cautiously, standing on tiptoes to peer at his new brother. "He's really small," he observed. "When can I teach him to ride?" Rebecca laughed tiredly from the bed. "Not for quite some time, sweetheart, but you can help teach him all sorts of other things first." Kurt sat on the edge of the bed, still holding James, and reached for Tommy with his free arm. "Being a big brother is an important job," he said seriously. "Your mother and I will need your help." Tommy nodded, suddenly solemn with the weight of this new responsibility. "I'll help, I promise." As Rebecca watched her family, her husband holding their newborn son, Tommy leaning against Kurt's side, she felt a sense of completion she had not thought possible after the tragedy that had marked her earlier life. The path that had led her here had been filled with both sorrow and joy, unexpected turns that had ultimately brought her to where she belonged. 2 years later, on a warm spring day, Rebecca stood with Kurt on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Tommy lead his younger brother by the hand across the yard. At 6.5, Tommy had become a responsible, caring big brother to James, who toddled after him with complete trust and admiration. "They're growing so fast," Rebecca commented, leaning against Kurt's solid presence beside her. Her hand rested on the slight swell of her abdomen, where their third child, a daughter, according to the midwife's prediction, was just beginning to make her presence known. Kurt wrapped his arm around her shoulders. That they are. Tommy's already asking when James can have his own horse. Rebecca laughed. Of course he is. That boy thinks everyone should be on horseback from the moment they can walk. Takes after his pa Kurt that way, Kurt replied with a smile. Then his expression grew more thoughtful as he looked out toward the distant mountains. I rode by your old cabin yesterday. Creeks running high with the spring melt, but nowhere near flood stage. Rebecca nodded. They had kept the cabin, using it occasionally as a line shack when working cattle on that part of their expanded property. She no longer felt the pang of loss when she saw it only a quiet acknowledgment of the life she had lived there and the path that had led from there to here. Sometimes I think about that night, she said softly. How close we came to losing everything. How one moment changed the course of our lives so completely. Kurt turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I thank God every day for bringing you and Tommy into my life, though I wish it hadn't taken such a frightening ordeal to make it happen. When I saw you fighting through those floodwaters with Tommy in your arms. Rebecca's voice caught with emotion even after all this time. I knew then, though I couldn't admit it to myself yet, that you were someone special, someone I could trust with not just our lives but our hearts. Kurt kissed her softly. And I intend to keep earning that trust every day for the rest of our lives. From the yard came Tommy's excited shout as James successfully tossed a small ball toward the target. Tommy had set up a milestone achievement for the toddler. Both parents turned to watch, sharing in their son's joy. Mama, Pa, Kurt, did you see? Tommy called, waving them over. James hit the target. We're coming, Rebecca called back. She took Kurt's hand and together, they stepped off the porch to join their children in the warm spring sunshine, the ranch around them thriving. Their family complete a future built from courage, sacrifice, and love that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances, with a desperate rescue from raging floodwaters that had washed away one life and, unexpectedly, created another.